Let's talk about it.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Thicc Radio. This is a podcast where we talk about gaining and fetism and everything in their orbit, and sometimes we talk about some other things as well, like the passing of good friends. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. Today we've got David joining us on the podcast.
Hello.
How are you today, David?
I'm okay, thank you. How are you both doing?
Doing okay.
Doing okay. Listeners, obviously we'll address all this right here. As you can see from the title of the episode, in Memoriam, it's a bit of a somber day here for us. Obviously releasing this as a special episode, but we're getting together today to remember a dear friend of ours. His name was Carl Jokl. He was a wonderful human being. For those of you who knew him, you may have known him as Mandroid. Do you guys know if he ever had another username? I feel like he might have done, but I can't quite remember.
Not as far as I'm aware. At least not since I've known him.
No, I can't think of any other name he went by.
Well, Carl is who we're talking about today. And if you wish to learn more about Carl, I believe his profile has been memorialized on Grommr, which is lovely. I believe as of right now, his Instagrams are still up, and we'll include those links in the show notes if you wish to go and see his page or maybe pay a respectful comment on any of his posts. But we're gathered today to remember him. And I was really passionate about wanting to do this because obviously hosting a podcast, that's a platform to talk. And I really wanted an opportunity to give some love to my friend. So somber as this is, we ready to get into it, y'all?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. Well, listen, David, as our special guest today, I wanna hit you up on these. So I wanna ask you, when did you first meet Carl?
That would have been for Eurogrommr in 2022. So what happened was, I think it was the Saturday, actually, around lunchtime. There was a group lunch. I had no idea where I was going. And I just sort of thought, I'll just meander out the front of the hotel and see what's going on. And there was Carl, just stood there on his phone, in typical Carl fashion, for those who knew him. But I didn't know him at the time. And I just sort of came up to him and thought, well, you must be one of us because you just look the part. And I just asked him, do you happen to know where lunch is? And he explained to me, well, I think it's down that way. I think we could probably just both walk down there. So off we went. And in that short little waddle for about 10, 15 minutes, he pretty much had told me most of his life story from a high level perspective, all of the good things that were going on, all of the bad. And by the time we were sat down ready to eat, I pretty much felt like I'd known him for years. So it was a lovely way to meet somebody.
I know that I'd encountered Carl at little Grommr moments around London prior to the cruise in 2021, but the cruise was the first, I think, proper moment Carl and I had to have a lot of social time. Prior to that, snatchings of conversation, just a cute little fuddy-duddy that you'd see at different places. You'd say, hi, hello, it's good to see you, and, just one of those people. You don't think, and then you get the chance to get to know them a little bit better, and it's a nice experience. And the cruise really was wonderful. I know we've talked about it on the pod before, but it was like you've said before, Tim, lightning in a bottle, just a wonderful time. And yeah, it was wonderful to get to meet with him in that space. Tim, I think did you have messages with him prior to the cruise?
If I'm remembering correctly, I believe he did. He left a comment on maybe a couple of the stories that I had posted over I think maybe the 6 months before the cruise, which got to a little bit of conversation. I think he may have been someone who asked me you guys have this podcast, it's growing in popularity. Like, how do you feel about, being so public, and do you feel any responsibility? And I was like, yeah, of course I do. And, I mentioned how I feel like I have to be careful about what I say and what I represent. And then physically meeting him was, I think he was one of the first people I met when I got to the hotel. I think I met him before I ran into you, actually. And I just remember that he was just very open immediately. He was very friendly. He was very warm, very welcoming. And through that whole cruise, like, that's what I remember the most, is like he was just this very honest, open person, very sweet. I'll admit here that on that first night at the hotel, we did have a little bit of time privately, and it was wonderful. I really have no complaint about it. So yeah, that's kind of my experience with Carl.
I love hearing that. I think for anyone who may have interacted with him online, and this is something I'll share, obviously when he passed and I found out, I did a little post to alert people. Because of course, anytime someone passes in an online community, it's hard because you don't know who their friends are. You don't know how to reach out to their specific friend group because it's so nebulous. How could you quantify it? So sometimes kind of doing a bit of a blast post is all you can really do to try and get the word out. And what I found really quite striking was the number of different people who sent me a little message to basically say, fuck, that is heartbreaking. And people who were desperate for any information about how he passed and what the situation was. And it was people who, there was an older guy from here in the UK in his mid to late 60s, a friend of ours who is in LA somewhere, who asked about it, and people all over the world. And it really dawned on me, we never really think about this. We exist in this online community where all of us are connected from all over the world, and when very real things happen, very real people are impacted all over the world. So as much as sometimes when we think about, I think, the typical passing and major life events that happen, and we think about our local community, I think it is good to consider that actually the ironic and literal weight of who and what we are can affect people all over the world. And I actually think that that's quite a beautiful thing, that there are literal snatchings of social circles and cultures all over the world that are affected because of these things that happen. And I just want to acknowledge that, the people who are listening, the people who knew him. That's another reason why we wanted to do this episode. This episode is for you all, so that there is an opportunity to share in this moment a memory of our dear friend. I want to ask you, David, tell us a little bit about your friendship in particular, because I know that you both got quite close in the time that you knew him.
Yeah, it was so it was an interesting friendship, really. So I mean, as I say, it started off in that Eurogromm, and I think after that initial lunch, I think I bumped into him a couple of times until we were then at that leaving lunch on the Monday. Now, I wasn't leaving on the Monday. I was actually going to be leaving on the Friday. I'd actually booked for the whole week because I just really needed a holiday. But no, Carl was sat with me at the table at this leaving lunch, and he was explaining to me how at the time he'd been made redundant, how he was on his own, and it was very much a case of, oh, well, what's the point? And I offered for him to stay with me for the rest of the week, just to give him a little bit of extra respite away from the crowds of the rest of the whole Eurogromm event, and just really to help him a little bit and see if it would give him a little bit of extra rest, so that when he went back, he could tackle things a bit more. So I mean, we spent a good 3.5 days together in the sun in Sitges. It was, it was absolutely lovely, and I think spending that time on your own in such a lovely setting, it's very difficult not to click and connect with somebody if you are, two very compatible people anyway. You're very, very easy to click with somebody, which we very much did. And it became that sort of friendship, really, where, I mean, initially when we got back to the UK, I kept popping down to London to help him sort out his flat. And then it was a case of he had issues with the landlord, and then he had to move out, and then, the other things happening and issues with his job. But all through that, I just had this sort of feeling that I just wanted to help him, sort of take him under my wing and look after him, which I don't know if he necessarily appreciated that all the time, but it was definitely something I was happy to do. But yeah, in return, I mean, he made me realize that there was more to life than just plodding along, as I was doing before then. He opened my eyes a little bit more to different possibilities and the bigger world out there that I didn't think was available to me until I met him, and he made me realize that actually the world is out there for the taking. So, in terms of how the actual friendship developed, it started off quite intense. I think I had very, very strong feelings for him. I think he probably was trying to protect me by not wanting to reciprocate them. I think he definitely enjoyed his time with me. But yeah, he was somebody I cared for very much. I wasn't really in a position to act upon that as such. But we were very good friends, and always there for each other, always supportive of one another. And it was a very great, lovely friendship.
I think something I reflect on is just how gracious Carl was often with his time. I think sometimes with people in the community, you can reach out. Sometimes people will humor you for a conversation, and you do sort of pick up relatively quickly, like, this person doesn't want to chat right now. But Carl always seemed to have time. Carl was always down to chat, and I think there were times when I maybe wasn't feeling too great. Carl was always willing to listen. And I think that speaks volumes about someone who, as I said before, I know has had an impact on people literally around the globe. And I think while we mourn the loss of that person, I think it is a beautiful thing to acknowledge the impact and power that his life has had on many different people. I do want to ask, what is the most vivid aspect of Carl that you continue to reflect on? I mean, obviously, I know that as you've expressed, there's that connection that you had, and obviously he's helped you to kind of see a little bit more about what you want out of life. Would you say that that's maybe the biggest part of him that you reflect on?
I think it's just, if I was to sum up 2 words for Carl, I think generosity would be one, and stoicism would be the other. As you were just saying about generosity with time, he would always make time for people. He would always go out of his way, I think, to help people who needed it. And this isn't for me, this is just from things I've heard from other people, from his family, that I've got to know in recent weeks. But also, when I refer to stoicism, he had a lot going on in his life. He had a serious heart condition. He had a lot of stress. He was suffering with his mental health. And yet, on top of all of that stuff, he would still soldier on, carry on going to work, carry on dealing with all of the problems that were being thrown at him to the best of his abilities, even if it felt like it was completely hopeless. And I think that is a quality that not many people have. I certainly don't have that myself. I'm hold my hands up. I'm the sort of person that when things get too tough for me personally, I kind of run away with my head screaming. But no, Carl wasn't like that. He would double down until he got done what needed to be done, until things fell apart and he literally wouldn't be able to do it anymore. And I think that is a huge quality in somebody that's often overlooked.
I was going to say that, this finding this out, this is new to me because we didn't have any conversations like this, but, I would have never known any of that because even though, yes, I would agree that he was stoic, he was always positive.
Yeah.
It was always like he wanted to have positive conversations. He wanted to say positive things. He wanted it to like always be going in that direction. And like I would have never known that he was struggling with anything, because I would have said he's very chipper, you know.
Mm,
And
mm.
one of the things that stuck out to me was his aesthetic, because I was like, this guy is so adorable. Like he's wearing suspenders, and I think weren't the suspenders like in the color of the bear pride
Yep.
flag?
He had Bear Pride flag suspenders. He usually had a Skeleton Crew t-shirt. Shout out to Josh and Psychic Productions. He was always a
Okay.
huge, every other post, everything you all wanted to do, he was always talking about it. And that was another thing I found about Carl. Carl was always so willing to put his efforts into something. There was a brief time where he'd said something about like, oh, maybe there should be more different social media for gainers. Like there's Grommr and there's Beefy Frat that's coming back, but maybe there needs to be something else, and maybe I could design it, and I could find some time to do this. I love to code, and he just seemed so excited at the very thought of it, and that's something else about Carl, I think. Sometimes you'd find yourself in a conversation where I think maybe you might think, oh, this subject is not necessarily for me, or oh, I'm not so invested in this. But Carl would be just so passionate, and you would just find yourself going, you know what? Let's talk about that right now. Let's see where this little rabbit hole takes us. And he was just so charming, and I think charming for me is the word that sums him up, because even though there would be moments where he would, rightfully so and logically so, keep to himself, do his own thing, not looking for conversation, he never didn't deliver when it came to connecting. That is something I think he did better than I think a lot of other people.
I really wish I could remember some of the conversations that we had that first night at the hotel in the lobby during the cocktail party, because I know there was a big group of us. We were all sitting around kind of holding court. And I wish I could remember some of the things that we talked about, but I honestly can't remember what any of the content of the conversation was. But he was right there, and he was adding to the conversation in very poignant ways. I just remember his presence and that he was engaged in the conversation.
For you in particular, David, I want to ask, I mean, it almost feels a bit silly to say, how has his passing affected you? I mean, we're all here. I think it's safe to say it's been a feeling. But I also want to ask, what has been your process thus far to coming to accept his passing?
Um, I, I, I wish I could say there was a process. I mean, it's really just been a series of harebrained schemes to try and cope, I think is probably the best, most accurate way of describing it. I mean, I'm not ashamed to say that I've taken a lot of time off work because of this, because he and I were very close. And yeah, I suppose even though we weren't together, it does feel very much like losing a partner or losing your boyfriend or something, because, that's how strongly I felt towards Carl. A couple of days after I found out, I went down to London to help with sorting out his things, and trying to do my bit for him. As I said before, I used to go down and help him clean his flat when he was living on his own. So this almost felt like a poetic ending, really, that I should go and help with a final cleanup of his things. And then shortly after that, I went over to Barcelona to visit some mutual friends of ours who were also very upset, and obviously living over there, they felt as if they were completely cut off and excluded from what was happening. So I thought it'd be nice to go and see them. And in the process, also went over to Sitges and revisited some of the places where Carl and I spent some time on that first week. It's been a case of trying to keep busy, I think. I was involved in talking to his family, trying to reason and arrange things in a way with them that would best represent him within the confines of, their religious beliefs, which has been challenging, but I have to give them credit. They've been absolutely lovely and, relatively open-minded about things, which has been great. Yeah, I went to visit him in the funeral home, which, yeah, that was a emotional experience. Seeing him laying there and being able to say goodbye. And of course, there was a funeral that yourself, James, you came with me. Thank you for that. It's very much appreciated. And speaking at that funeral, writing a small eulogy about him chasing his rainbows. Yeah, it was difficult. It's been a very, very difficult journey to get through. But, it's one of those things you have to learn from Carl, and he was a stoic. He carried on, he pushed through. I think if he was here right now, he would be saying, oh, well, I don't know why you're making such a massive fuss over this. You just need to get on with it. Sometimes I wish I was more like Carl, but unfortunately not. So, but, here we are.
For me, and I'm going to share this here because I know that I haven't necessarily made this statement on the pod before, but with the situation that occurred for me a couple of years back, which was difficult to say the least, Carl was the only person in the London scene who stood by me. Carl was the only person in the London scene who maintained contact, never faltered, saw right through it all, and as far as I'm aware, told people off when they would say shit in his presence, which... And when you think about someone who, in many ways, I think probably felt like he didn't fit in, because his interests weren't necessarily the same as everyone else's, and his way of going about things wasn't the same as everyone else's, so he probably felt on the outs a little bit, but comparative to a lot of other people, he showed real courage and real friendship. And so it has been, for me, quite heartbreaking to lose someone who loves so fearlessly. I was very privileged to have had it the way I did when I did. So, just going to share that here. And is there something that Carl has said to you in particular that has stood out in your memories, like a phrase or a joke or a moment that really comes to mind?
There are a couple. I mean, it's funny actually. I used to think he did this to everybody, but apparently it was only me. So he would often sort of just come up to me and poke me and just go bear at me quite a lot. Often as a kind of silence breaker, I suppose, or an icebreaker when we've not been saying anything, or if he just felt like doing it for whatever reason. I always used to think it was incredibly cute that he did that. But yeah, until he passed away, I just assumed he did it to lots of people. Apparently not, according to people I've asked. So that was always very sweet. But I think, again, unfortunately, this is a bit of a negative thing that he said to me. But it's the one thing that at the moment keeps repeating. And it's that he said to me that he didn't think anyone would miss him if he died. And obviously that's a very upsetting thing to hear. And he said that to me a few times, and each time I would refute it and tell him that obviously I would. I'm sure many others would as well. It's something he would say a few times. He did say a few times. And just looking at the outpouring of emotion that's happened since he passed away, there are many people all across the world who knew him in person, who knew him from online, and also his family who he didn't believe cared about him or didn't even want to know him. The number of people at that funeral many of whom he hadn't seen in years, who'd all went up there and spoke about him at that pulpit. I've never seen a funeral like it, for a normal member of the public, where so many people are there and so many people are willing to speak. It was really touching, and I'm just glad that that's the one thing that he's been proven wrong about.
I do want to ask, to pivot a little bit to maybe some brighter times. I want to hear from you two memories. I want the funniest memory, and I want your favorite memory of Carl.
Okay. I mean, the funniest one seriously has to be okay. So this was quite a sweet story. So I was supposed to be going home. We're on our way to the train station on the tube, and he said to me, well, he'd asked me at the beginning of the weekend whether or not I would go to Regent's Park with him, because he'd told me about these like love seats that he would see couples on, or couple seats, as I don't know if that's what he called them. And he told me this story, and I thought it was quite upsetting or sad, but he had often gone through the park and had seen these benches with couples on them, and always thought to himself that he would never ever get to sit there with somebody and experience what those people were experiencing. And I said, well, maybe that's something we can do. And we were on the tube heading to the station, and he said to me, we still haven't managed to do the seats. And I said, right, okay, well, let's get off. We'll go to Regent's Park and we'll do that now. So I would, delay going home. We'll go and do that. On the way, he decided, oh, let's go and grab a coffee. Let's go and grab a drink. Went to Starbucks, and he got this, I think it was a salted caramel frappuccino or something like that. He's wandering around and he's slurping it through the straw on his way, and gets to the end. What's left he can suck up with the straw, and there's this massive lump of cream in the bottom of this cup. And in typical Carl style, not wanting to waste any calories, he just went, ooh, tipped the cup up into his face, and this cream just went shmush straight into his nose, all over his moustache. And he pulled the cup down, and it was just, it just looked like somebody had thrown a cream snowball at his face in the middle of his nose. And he just looked adorable. He just was absolutely adorable. And we tried wiping it off, and it was just there. It was just there for a little while. It was just, it was just a typical Carl thing to do, but it's just that one of those things that just sticks in my memory. It's just been really funny. In terms of my favorite memory, it's probably going right the way back to the beginning. So going back to when we were both in Sitges, he by the Thursday, so the day before we were both going to leave, pretty much everyone else had already left. So we were the only two left in the whole of Sitges from this event. And it was lovely. We had the whole place to ourselves. The hotel was quiet. We were wandering around the beach, people watching, doing the last bits of holiday shopping. And it was adorable just being able to sort of sit on a bench looking out to sea in this sort of little gay paradise where you can just snuggle up and be yourself and be completely at ease and be completely comfortable in such a lovely warm setting. And I just wish we'd got to do that again.
So for me, my favorite memory was actually the first time that we caught up after that situation had occurred, and I just remember Carl, the Carl that I'd met on the cruise, had the chance to talk to a little bit more properly. Not that he wasn't physically affectionate, but he'll give a little hug and talk and move on. But I just have this very distinct memory of he was sat on this bench and he got up. I was walking over, gets up, and he had his laptop. He'd come from work, and we're in a park, Greenwich Park, in public, people around us, but it didn't seem to matter. He dropped everything on that bench. And when I tell you, that man sped walked over to me and pulled me in for the biggest hug I've ever had. And it was just wonderful. And it really made me feel like in that moment I knew that, oh, everything would be okay, you know. And this isn't quite a funny memory, but I do want to share this because you told me about this. And I want to share this with the full understanding that if Carl were here right now, he would find it absolutely hysterical. When Carl had passed, and in the process of having him removed from the premises, they had to break a banister to get him out. And David, I think you had said to me that one of the men hurt himself in the process.
That is my understanding. They were two fairly biggish guys, sort of middle-aged, and they were, from what I was told, sweating profusely whilst trying to lift this over 300-pound lump down some very, very tight stairs. And in trying to maneuver him round one of the corners on the stairs, one of them accidentally dropped him onto the banister and broke it, leaving our mutual friend with a big hole in his banister as a reminder of his ex-lodger. So yes, I did think at the time that Carl, if he's up there, would be giggling away at that. It's almost like that was an achievement somehow.
And if I can say this as well, because as you mentioned before, I came with you to the funeral. Of the 7 eulogies spoken at the temple, 4 of them mentioned his weight gain. And it was just, and I mean this is no shade whatsoever, because of course some of these were intentionally light-hearted memories of Carl. Some of them were quite mournful. But it didn't seem to matter what type of eulogy was being delivered. There was just this sort of moment that would come where they would just be like, and when I went to go see my baby brother, I was so shocked. He was so different. He was so fat. I almost didn't recognize him. It was just, and I'm sat next to you in the middle of crying sorrow, suddenly pivoting to trying not to burst out laughing, thinking that this is the most wonderful memory of Carl, that everyone in this room is suddenly being faced with the reality that he was absolutely enormous. Because also, we'd gotten there a little early to the site because we didn't follow the procession. We'd gotten there a little bit early, and someone had driven past, and they pulled up next to me because I went outside to be a bit alone for a sec. And they pulled up and they were like, "Oh, he's gonna be over there." Yeah. Oh, they've got the crane out. I was like, "The crane?" They're like, "Yeah, they have to use the crane when the person being buried is over a certain weight." So again, I choose to look at these moments like, do you know what? That's a fist bump for Carl. Carl, wherever Carl is, he's cheering that on,
It's another life achievement, or post-life achievement, I suppose you could call it.
So I want to pivot to more of a general conversation around death, because Tim, you and I have talked about this before. This is an episode topic that we have felt needs to happen because it's a conversation that doesn't happen. And the first thing here, and I know we've sort of spoken a little bit about, Carl's struggle with health and mental health. We just want to be very clear with this. As of right now, there is no affirmation that his passing was due to his weight or due to illnesses exacerbated by his weight. I think that's very important to say right off the cuff, because ultimately, this is something that I know that I often ponder. If there are people in the community that passed, I don't intend that thought to cross my mind, but it is the very first thought that crosses my mind. Was it weight related? Was it their diet? Is this a result of the gaining lifestyle? It is a moment of panic that flickers into existence because we don't talk about this. But I think for a sec, we should talk about weight and death. So, Tim, if I can defer to you here as our medical expert, what are the realities of weight and fat specifically influencing our likelihood to pass?
Well, I mean, I think we touched on this topic in one of the health episodes about, obesity can sometimes lead to atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries due to plaque deposits and things like that. So, as much as we could sit here and say, yes, being overweight can lead to an early death, there are plenty of situations in which it does not. So like health is relative to the individual. The reality of being, I can speak to this a little bit, and I will know more when I become a mortician, but the reality of being large and then passing, like you guys had mentioned the story about breaking the banister. Like there are some challenges to being large and passing, and like what is going to be done with your body. I mean, I do know, because I've done some research on this, they do sell caskets for very large body sizes. That is possible. You can get one of those. And I believe that most crematory machines have been fitted to also take larger bodies now. Used to be a much smaller opening, but I think that has changed in recent times. So it is completely possible to observe all of the rituals of burial and mourning of a person who is a larger size. And like I said, I will know a lot more when I become a mortician. But it's not like because I've heard this question, and I've asked this question myself when I've had patients who were somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 or 700 pounds when they passed away. I was like, how do you bury a body that big? How do you cremate a body that big? And funeral homes were able to answer my questions with that. Like, one was like, yeah, we have a machine that can actually fit a person of this size, or like we sell caskets that will fit this size. So
I think to that point, then maybe a point of importance for any of us in the community would be to be aware of things like that. I looked this up once upon a time, and I believe that a standard casket only carries up to about 300 pounds of human flesh, and then extended weights go up to about 500. So it's worth considering. If you weigh above a certain threshold, certain things are access wise not going to be available for you. We mentioned before about the crane having to lower Carl into the ground, which is a cost, plot size, duration, all of these things. So while this is, again, not a fun topic, these are the realities of death when plus size. And I know that Ask a Mortician has a particular video about this. Is that right, Tim?
she does. Yeah, she does. So if you wanted to know more, definitely go check out her YouTube channel, and just check her out in general, because I find her very fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
There was one thing that I wanted to say that I was furiously trying to look up the quote and I couldn't find it. And I don't know if it's going to make a lot of sense to people when I read this, but so this is a quote from Little Nemo, which was a comic that was put out in the 1910s. And I believe it was done by Carl Fleischer. I think that was his name. But it's from one of the panels, and it's just something that Nemo says kind of offhandedly as he's climbing, he's in the dreamscape. He's climbing down like a skyscraper, and he's large because this is a dream. And as he's passing the windows, he says, "These people ought to know who we are and tell that we are here." And that's why I think something like this is important, because here's something that is a reality, and it might sound a bit depressing, but I just want you guys to let it sink in. We talk about immortality, right? We talk about the true immortality that that humans can achieve is leaving something behind that future generations will be able to look back on. For the majority of us, that's probably not going to happen. Like, we will be remembered by our families and our friends, but after about 2 or 3 generations, no one's going to remember our names, And I think that's why that quote has always stuck with me. Nemo's talking about people that exist in a dreamscape. These are people he would never, they probably don't even really exist because it's all in his imagination. But even as a child, he's able to say, "These people ought to know that we are here." And that's always meant something to me. And this is why we have to talk about things that are emotionally upsetting or difficult to talk about, because the story still needs to be told.
I think it's very obviously it's very much an individual choice, and it's very much an individual approach to how people want to deal with it. I don't think it's anyone's place to say you have to consider this or that. But I do think it's important, really, for just people to understand the reality of gaining and of being of a larger size and the impact it can have. I think there's a lot of people, perhaps, who do like to pretend that everything's fine and this is all stuff that's going to happen to somebody else, when the reality is that they're putting themselves in a situation where it's more likely going to affect them anyway. I mean, to be clear, like we were saying, it isn't weight. Gaining wasn't actually the reason for Carl's death. It was due to the fact he had a serious heart condition, which had nothing to do with his weight, and the way that was being managed. But yeah, I do think, as I say, it's just important for people to realize the risks of what they're doing. By all means, enjoy it. I enjoy it. I think everyone on this chat is on this podcast enjoys it. So don't stop enjoying it. Just be aware and just try and mitigate risk as much as possible. Is all I would say.
Mm. I want to close out on something here that was shared with me a couple of years ago now. That David, I think I shared this with you over dinner, actually the night before, and it's the reality that the universe will not forget us, because the way that light and photons work is that energy never dies. In order for us to have the concept of sight and vision, photon particles bounce off our flesh into our retinas and go through all these neurons and pathways in the brain and eventually are transformed into an image. But the way that works is that the physical properties of the photon have to touch the thing and then enter us. And then it is fused with us in order to become memory. So in order for us to even see someone and to think and reflect and have memory of them, we are connecting physiologically with something that was once a part of someone else. So when we say that someone can live on in us, there is a physiological truth to it. And all the light particles that bounce off and away and shoot out on into the universe transform and become physical matter. In the case of sound waves and the things that become in the bodies of stars, the very nebulae that we look up into the heavens and see are shaped and formed because of the actions of a universe born long, long ago. And the very fact that we exist can shape that forever. So even though we might have our mortality, the universe does not forget us. And even in our passing, we rejoin the universe itself. So for the non-religious listening, there are some very beautiful ideas about how we can quantify death and qualify our own meaning in the vastness of all the things that we are a part of. So talking about, life achievements, what do you want listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the thing to take away from this is life's too short. Carl was a 42-year-old man with a serious health condition, and he lived his best life as much as he could. He had a lot of struggles. He had a lot of things going on. And I think what I would say to people is, if there's things you want to do, do it. If there are health conditions that are affecting you, deal with them. Don't hide from them. I just think that's something that may not sit easy with a lot of people, but I think it's a reality people need to be aware of.
Life is fleeting, unfortunately. And I think that when you're a certain age, it's not that you develop this Superman complex or anything, but it's more like you're just not aware of how quickly something can happen. And you kind of think, oh, that's not something I have to worry about until I'm in my 60s, my 70s, my 80s. I've unfortunately been losing a lot of friends, and I'm only 40 years old, and I keep telling myself like this shouldn't be happening at this age. But then I have to remember like that is just life. Shit happens, chaos happens, people are suddenly taken away from you. So you have to, as cliche as it is to say don't take anything for granted, that really is the most important message. Don't take for granted the time that you do have.
Something that actually kind of sat with me recently, I did a bit of a rewatch of the sort of short run He-Man animated series that they did on Netflix, and there's this character Orko, and one of the many moments that happens for Tila, he talks about carrying a diary, and he says it's important to make a note of all the fun times because one day your friends will go and all you will have are those memories. And so what I would want listeners to take away from today is not necessarily about the passing of people and everything else, but it is to be conscious of celebrating the moment that we are in. Take photos, write stories, journal, make Tumblr posts and Grommr posts and write stories and produce content and art and fiction and everything, and remember these moments and remember that people were here because we were, and life is worth living and life is worth remembering. And as heavy as I'm sure this episode has been, I want to take a moment to thank everyone for listening. And I want to thank you, especially David, for making time and space in your heart to share your thoughts and feelings, for being with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, in the traditional customaries of how we like to do things here on the podcast, where can our listeners find you online?
Oh, well, you can find me on Grommr. You can find me on Instagram. Same username. It's Lord Pontifrite. You can blame my silly 16-year-old self for that daft username. But yes, you can find me in those two places.
Wonderful. And for anyone who wishes to pay respects to Carl, or even visit his pages to share in a little memory, you can find him on Grommr at Mandroid, or on Instagram at Mandroid, where the letters are subbed out for the usual numbers, but we'll put all of that in the show notes. But that is it for this Memoriam and this special episode of Thicc Radio. I'm not going to do the usual end of plug here, but I will just say you can find me on Instagram and BlueSky at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at thiccmouse. You can also look us up on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Thicc Radio, or at our website, podpage.com/Thicc Radio. If you want to submit a voice note or become a financial supporter of the show, you can find the links in the show notes. And as always, you can write to us at thiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Enter app podcast produced by Stannnum and Thicc Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by lordpontifrite.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify.